Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 31st of December of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, but today we will just discuss not just updates of 31st of December, we will try to remember what exactly did happen during the previous year, during very bloody 2023. And we are going to start from Belgorod, then we're going to move step by step from Belgorod to Kherson, and we'll try to remember everything that happened. And when talking about Belgorod, we will remember this city, the area between Kharkiv and Belgorod, as with the footage that we got yesterday, when the Ukrainians bombed this territory with cluster rounds, with Vampire multi-launch rocket system with Czech production and Olhav Ukrainian one. And as a result of those attacks, a significant number of civilians were wounded and killed. And you need to understand one thing about that attack. I know I read a lot of updates, either the Russians and the Ukrainian, and you know that I haven't found even a single note, neither from the Russian or from the Ukrainian side, that as a result of yesterday bombardments of Belgorod with cluster rounds, at least one military soldier was wounded. At least wounded, I'm not saying even killed. So as a result of yesterday's attack, not even a single Russian soldier was wounded or killed. So that was obviously an attack against civilians. During the previous night, the Russians launched significant number of missiles. For example, on this footage, we can see the launches of Iskander missiles. And as a result of those strikes, the Russians managed to damage and destroy the Ukrainian, positions of Ukrainian forces inside of Kharkiv. For example, by the evening, we got the footage of that attack. This is some car moving along the city, and this is the result of strike with Russian missile. The Russians are saying that they attacked the hotel in this area. According to the Russians, there were around 200 volunteers or instructors or mercenaries from the Western countries. And important thing about this situation is that today official Russian sources, official Russian media channel Russia Today reported and blamed that attack was made under the personal order of the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. He was the person who ordered and launched that operation. The executors of that operation was the forces of National Battalion Kraken, and their main base was located in Chiguyev. From Chiguyev they moved to border, and from the border they attacked Belgrade with cluster rounds. So that was, as we discussed, an attack, the first probably attack since the beginning of the special military operation, when even a single soldier or military person wasn't wounded. But that attack is not the only thing we will remember Belgorod. Also, this is the area. I'll remind you that in May of 2023, after the Ukrainians lost control over Bakhmut, the Ukrainians made a special operation on the borderlands. They crossed this area and established control over a few settlements and villages on this direction, and that attack had the main purpose to change the focus. The Ukrainians captured the villages like Kazinka, like Gaivarun, Glotova, but the Russians managed to regroup very fast, and as a result of Russian counter-offensive operation, first they managed to block the Ukrainians, and after that the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to step back. But that wasn't the main purpose for the Ukrainians to hold this area. The main purpose of that attack from the Ukrainian side was once again to change the focus and to force people all over the world to pay attention to this area, but not to the Bakhmut and the loss of Bakhmut. Now we are moving to Kupiansk area. We also have a lot of updates during the year, but this year, the 2023, we will remember for Russian endless offensive operation. During the year, according to the endless number of Ministry of Defense report, the Russians were improving their edge positions on the combat line. The Russians were attacking, but as we can see, during the year, the Russians haven't managed to achieve significant results, and probably the most important reason is that the Ukrainians managed to redeploy a significant number of forces further, also from strategical reserve, and the Ukrainians, to tell the truth, by the end of the year, we can say this for 100%, managed to repel every single Russian attack in direction of Sinkovka, Stepova, Novoselovka, Ivanovka, Kislovka, Kotlerovka. The Russians haven't managed to crack this nut, but this is not the end. Obviously, this is not the end of operation, because no matter the difficult situation, the Russians during the year managed to establish control over a number of villages and settlements, Ukrainians. The Russians captured the village Masyutovka. The Russians managed to improve their positions in the forest between Liman Первый and Sinkovka, and furthermore, by the end of the year, the Russians did manage to enter the village. Probably they haven't managed to establish like a secured safe foothold, like stable one, but anyway, this is also the progress. And of course, there was a progress from the Russian side in this area, but when talking about progress, we need to talk about the village by the name of Novoselovskaya. This is the only village on Kupinsk's direction that the Russians managed to establish control over during the Russian offensive operation. And the clashes for this village to have been taking place probably for a year. The Ukrainians, during their Kharkiv counter-offensive operation, managed to establish control over the foothold between Oskol and Zherebets River. And after the Russians managed to make mobilization, managed to fill this combat line with manpower, the Russians started their offensive operation, counter-offensive operation, and as a result of those attacks, they returned control over the village. But after that, for some reason, the Russians took a decision not to continue this offensive operation, not to develop this attack further, and they took a decision to wait for some maybe better conditions or something like this. Also, when talking about Liman, we will remember this area for two things, of course, and the first thing is the Russian attempt to attack in direction of Cherneshina and Barova. If you remember, during the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation, the Russians launched an unexpected attack from Raigorodka. The Russians managed to cross Zherebets River and to establish a foothold on the Ukrainian side of this river. But after a few days or maybe weeks of clashes, very difficult clashes, the Ukrainians managed to regroup some forces from strategical reserves and to stabilize the area, and after that the Russians stopped. Maybe that was the main plan of the Russians, to force the Ukrainians to stretch their forces or something like this, but during the summer period of time, the Russians made few attempts to attack the villages Novoyegorovka, but all those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians, and after that the Russians took a decision to stop this offensive operation and to stabilize this area. During the late summer and autumn, the Ukrainians made few attempts to counterattack on the line Nadia-Sergeyevka, but all those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, took a decision to stabilize and to freeze the situation until the better times. When talking about Liman area, we have also another another events that we will remember this foothold, and we're talking about the battle for Tarskoye salient. If you remember, when the Ukrainians managed to implement and complete their Kharkiv counter-offensive operation, they have almost got the villages like Chervonopopovka and Kreminna, and this was the best Ukrainian progress. This line was the best Ukrainian progress during the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation, and the edge Ukrainian positions were almost in front of the Kreminna, and according to some sources, the Ukrainians even managed to establish fire control over the road between Chervonopopovka and Kreminna. But after that, the Russians regrouped and started a series of counterattacks, very successful ones, and as a result of Russian counterattacks, the Russians managed to create Tarskoye salient, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back and basically to run away, and this is the current configuration. So the Russians created Tarskoye salient, and by the end of the year, the Russians relaunched or renewed offensive operation in direction of Terny, Yampolovka, and Novosadovo-Nevskaya, and as a result of those recent attacks, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to get closer to the river. So this is 2023 for Liman direction. Of course, we can talk a lot about Kreminna forest, Serebryanka forest, but as you can see, during the year the front line in this area haven't been changed, and mainly due to the natural factors, natural barriers like forest, difficult configuration of the area, so no changes for this territory. And now we are moving to Solidar direction, Siversk area. And to tell the truth, the year started with this foothold. If you remember, in the beginning of 2023, the Russians announced about the Orthodox Christmas ceasefire, and after the end of that ceasefire, the Russians, as a result of an unexpected and very powerful attack, managed to penetrate the Ukraine defense belt in Solidar, and basically the Russians started the Bakhmut offensive operation. And as a result of those attacks, the Russians captured Solidar, the Russians captured Mykolaievka, the Russians got very close to Vasyukovka, the Russians got Zaliznyanskaya, and many other cities on Solidar direction, and also the Russians managed to get enter Paraskovyevka, Dubovo-Vasilyevka, Berkhovka, Podgorodnya, and basically that was the beginning of Bakhmut offensive and storm operation. After the Russians captured Solidar, we haven't received anything during the year from Siversk direction, and just by the end of 2023 we start receiving more updates about Russian progress along the railways in direction of Vyemka, about the Russian progress in Sporne. Some sources are saying that the Russians even managed to capture this territory, but also we need to note that during the year, at the beginning of this year, Sporne was under Russian control, but as a result of Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians were forced to step back. So this settlement was already under the Russian control, and now the Russians are trying to restore. And that's it about Siversk. The Ukrainians managed to improve their positions during the year. As you can see, they created a significant number of strongholds, and the battle for Siversk probably will take place in 2024. And now we are moving, of course, to Bakhmut itself. During the 2023, the Russians captured this city, and the final date, the end date of the battle, is 21st to 22nd of May. The victory of Bakhmut was announced by Prigozhin, the head of PMC Wagner. He reported about complete establishing control over this territory, and furthermore, as a result of Wagner offensive operation, the Russians control everything that located below this red line. Klishchievka and the fortifications along channel. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians also control some foothold on the Ukrainian side of this channel, but later the Ukrainians, during their summer counter-offensive operation, using the forces of 80th Air Assault Brigade, 93rd Brigade, 22nd Brigade, Loot Assault Brigade, 3rd, 92nd, 5th and 3rd Assault Brigade, managed to establish and return these positions and return control over Klishchievka, and the Ukrainians managed to return control over Andreevka. The regional plan of the Ukrainians during the 2023 was to return control over Bakhmut, and if they had some progress and some success on the southern part of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were completely defeated on the northern flank, because if you remember, the Ukrainians were trying to move along the railways and the south of Bogdanovka, and the main purpose and the main plan of the Ukrainians was to capture the cities like Berkhovka and Yagidne. But as a result of those attacks, even at the maximum, let's say, development of that attack, I remember that Ukrainians managed to enter even the southeast part of Berkhovka and to create more or less stable foothold. But as a result of Russian counteroffensive, the Ukrainians were completely defeated, destroyed, and were forced to step back towards Bogdanovka and towards Khromovo. The Ukrainian progress was reduced till zero, and that was the end of Ukrainian operation of Bakhmut encirclement. And now, as we can see, the Russians have complete initiative by the end of this year. And furthermore, when talking about the northern flank, the Russians managed to restore control over every single positions they had by the 22nd of May. And furthermore, the Russians started adding new territories. And we are talking about Bogdanovka and the progress in the area of Grigorovka. Of course, when talking about the southern flank, the Russians haven't managed to restore by the end of this year the entire territory control. The Ukrainians still hold Klishchievka and Andreevka, but as I understand, 2024, the Russians will continue movements in this area, because, for example, today we got the geolocated video confirmation of Russian progress along the railways on the south of Andreevka, and as a result of another storming operation, the Russians managed to capture and to clear trenches along this territory. So before the next video in 2024, in the 1st of January of 2024, we will update this map and show this territory along the railways under Russian control. So we see that the Russians continue movements and continue reducing the Ukrainian progress of of the greatest counteroffensive operation 2023. Also, we need to mention probably Ukraine attempts to attack on the line Priviliye-Zaliznyanskaya. The 30th Mechanized Brigade made a few attempts to attack on this line, and they managed to achieve some results, managed to capture some strongholds along the road between Minkovka and Zaliznyanskaya, but that attack was stopped by the Russians. The Russians counterattacked. The Ukrainians had losses and were forced to step back from this forest, and the Russians still control this area, as I understand, and probably the next year they will try to improve their positions as well. When talking about Bakhmut, probably the most important update, and not just update, but the most important person is Prigozhin, the head of Wagner PMC. We remember that after the battle for Bakhmut, he has a conflict with the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu. We remember the case with attempt from PMC Wagner to make a military coup. We remember the Wagner forces who were moving from LPR and DPR in direction of Rostov-on-Don. We remember how Wagner's managed to capture and establish control over general staff, over the main Russian office, military office, and the special military operation. We remember the Russian convoys heading from Rostov-on-Don towards Moscow. We remember the helicopters that Wagner's managed to shut down. We remember that the Wagners have almost got Moscow. They bypassed Voronezh. They bypassed significant numbers of cities. They stretched their forces. They were planning to enter Moscow from different directions. We remember significant number of helicopters, even airplanes were shut down by Wagners, and that was a real situation. That was the real situation, and I remember those days. That was very crazy. But at some point, Wagner stopped because the president of Russian Belarus, Lukashenko, called him and he gave him his guarantees that everything is going to be okay with him and Wagner forces, and military coup stopped. Nothing happened. A situation was, let's say, resolved, and after that, Wagner PMC probably were dismissed, and we remember a lot of videos of redeployment of Wagner forces to the territory of Belarus. They tried to build their base somewhere in the vicinity of Babruska, Sipovich, ex-military base. There were training programs. Then we remember how Prigozhin was flying to Africa. He was trying to find himself in this region of the world, but there was a conflict between him and Shoigu, and probably he had too many enemies, and at some day his airplane with his second deputy commander, Ghost, they were killed, or as a result of terrorist attack, or according to Russian official investigation, there was a bomb grenade on board, and something happened. So that was the 2023 for this person, obviously the person that the world will remember forever. Now we are moving to the south, to Gorlovka direction, where we also had a lot of updates. When the Russians started their Avdiivka news operation, and when the Russians managed to penetrate the first defense belt of the Ukrainians took a decision to start an expected attack in direction of Gorlovka. And as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the landfills and terracons. And to tell the truth, at some minute I was very, very worried about the Russians' defense belt, but later the Russians managed to regroup, to concentrate forces, to counterattack, and to repel and return every single terracon under their own control. The Ukrainians were forced to step back, and now they're not making any attempts to repeat something like this. When talking about Avdiivka, the end of this year is finishing under the flag of Avdiivka news operation. The Russians were trying the Ukrainians from many directions. At some directions they managed to get some results, like southern direction as a result of Russian attack. We remember this area, how this situation was developed. If you remember, there was like a stronghold, and the Russians managed to create a tunnel and to establish like explosion under the first Ukrainian defense belt, and basically they destroyed everything, sand to the sky. And after that was the first day of Russian offensive operation, and after that the entire area was fell. and the Ukrainian defense belt collapsed. Furthermore, the Russians made few attempts to attack in the direction of Severnaya Tonenka, but after 3 months, October, November, December of offensive operation, the Russians still haven't managed to enter these two villages because of very powerful strongholds in front of them. The only stronghold the Russians managed to capture is the stronghold that lays on the way to 9th quarter, 9th block, and according to some sources, the Russians have captured this territory. When talking about northern direction, the situation develops not very good for the Russians, to tell the truth, not in Russian favor, because according to information we have, at some directions the Ukrainians launched their own counter-offensive operation, and at some points the Russians were forced to step back. We're talking about the railways lines from Ocheretina to Krasnogorovka and in the vicinity of Stepova. Now this is the area where the Ukrainians probably has some initiative, and the area where the Ukrainians start counter-offensive. Now the Russians need to find the solution how not to lose the gains and the footholds they established during their attack, and to regroup and probably to wait for better circumstances to renew their offensive operation. So this is Avdiivka, and this is Avdiivka news operation. When talking about the other updates from this territory, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that after yesterday's attacks on Belgorod, the Russians launched significant number of missiles and drones over the entire Ukraine. As we discussed, the Russians bombed Kharkiv, where there is Kharkiv Hotel, Kharkiv Palace, and up to 200 soldiers, foreign volunteers and instructors were located in that building. Also, the Russians attacked Selidova, this new center, new headquarters of Ukrainian army, new central center of Ukrainian operations in Avdiivka and the South Donetsk direction. And as a result of that strike, the Russians reported they managed to destroy buildings and area of concentration of Ukrainian forces, to be more precise, of 59th and 72nd brigades. And this is the 59th brigade, a brigade that located in Nevskaya Pervomayskaya, and this is 72nd and 79th brigade that located in Novomikhailovka and Ugledar. So according to the Russians, in these buildings that they managed to destroy, it was the, let's say, the positions and the places of concentration of Ukrainian forces where there were around 600 soldiers. We don't know exactly the numbers of losses, but probably the Russians managed to get somebody. Of course, we will remember 2023 for the greatest Russian victory for Marinka. As a result of clashes since probably 2015, it's like correct to tell like this, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village and to continue offensive operation further. They got operational space, and now they can move in many directions, and one of the possible direction is Novomikhailovka. The Russians were bombing this village very heavy since the beginning of this year. We start focusing our attention to this village probably from July, start adding geolocations, FAPs, and so on. And by the end of 2023, the Russians managed to got the village and to capture some positions on the edge of the village on the south and to the east. Now we are moving to the South Donetsk direction, and probably the most important town is Ugledar. During the previous 2023, the Russians made significant number of attempts to storm this village, but all those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. Some sources are saying that the Russians made 4 attempts to attack in the direction of Ugledar. The Russians had significant losses. Probably they managed to improve their positions in the villages like Mykoyska, in the residential area, also in the city, in the village by the name of Pavlovka. But we see that the Russians haven't managed to get, let's say, tactical superiority or tactical advance, just small gains that can't change the global situation in this area. So we'll see what 2024 will bring for this territory. When talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, probably this is the only area where the Ukrainians managed to get more or less results as a result of their greatest counteroffensive operation. As a result of attacks, the Ukrainians established control over Vremivka, Neskучная, Урожайная, Staromayorskaya, Makarovka, Blagodatная. All these villages along Mokry Yaly River were captured by the Ukrainians as a result of their greatest counteroffensive operation. Important note about this area is that this is the only territory of Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation where the Russians took a decision not to counterattack at all and not to return anything. Because, for example, when talking about Bakhmut and Artyomov's direction, the Russians managed to restore almost 95% of the territory they lost during the Ukraine's greatest counteroffensive operation. The Russians managed to restore positions in the vicinity of Avdiivka because the Ukrainians were attacking in this area as well. The Russians managed to return almost like maybe 30% of territory they lost on Bradley Square area. But when talking about Vremivka, nothing, even not a single square meter was returned by the Russians. There were some improvements from the Russian side to the north of Priyutina, but it's not so important and not so valuable in comparison with, let's say, with the next, let's say, purposes or the next goals from this direction. Maybe in 2024 the Russians will continue and will attack the Ukrainians, but I have doubts, some doubts that the Russians are planning to do this. So I believe that the 2024 for this territory will be the same as the final days, the final months of 2023. A very interesting area as for me of 2023 was Gulay Polya. This is another stronghold as Orekhov, and there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers and a very powerful defense built from the Russian side, but for some reason the Ukrainians took a decision not to use this territory, and there were no clashes on the line Pologi Gulay Polya during the entire year. And this is very strange. There are, in the special military operation, there are two areas where there are no clashes at all. It's Gorlovka, and just by the end of the year, the Ukrainians attacked and captured a few landfills just for 1 week probably. And Gulay Polya is the second area where there are no clashes at all. Just a small activity, and that's it. When talking about Bradley Square, and this area has the name of Bradley due to significant number of Western weapons that were destroyed during the Ukrainians' greatest counteroffensive operation that started on the 4th of June. As a result of that attack, the Ukrainians, as a result of greatest Ukrainian counteroffensive operation, they lost up to 140,000 soldiers, significant number. As a result of those attacks, they managed to establish some control, full control over Robotyne and the fortification area to the west of Verbova, but by the end of 2023 the Russians managed to regroup and they launched their own counteroffensive, and now the Russians are returning back the territory under their control. A significant number of square meters and fields were already returned by the Russians, and the Russians continued their offensive operation. As of today, we got another update about another Russian control on the fields between Robotyne and Verbova. The Russians managed to return control over this territory as well, and the sources are saying that the Russians continue advancing and continue pushing the Ukrainians. I'll remind you that the main reason why the Ukrainians start losing the battle for Robotyne and Verbova is that they were forced to redeploy significant number of their forces from this area to Avdiivka. And we are talking about 47th Mechanized Brigade, 116th Brigade, 33rd Brigade, and many other brigades were redeployed from this area. 46th Brigade was redeployed to Marinka. So that's why there is a gap, and the Russians are using this situation in their favor, and probably the Russians will continue to in 2024 forcing the Ukrainians to step back. And obviously in the first months of 2024 we're going to see the first clashes inside of Robotyne when the Russians will try to return complete control over this foothold, because the Russians understand no matter the talks, no matter the absence of Ukrainian support in the end, military support from Western countries in the end, in late 2023, we understand that Ukrainians will receive weapons. They're going to mobilize another 500,000, and obviously the May of 2024 will start from the area they finished this year, and they will continue movements to Tokmak. And the Russians understand that if they want to start everything from the beginning, if they want to force the Ukrainians to start everything from the beginning during the winter period of time, they need to return control over this foothold. They need to return control over everything that, let's say, in this area. And if they can do this, then the Ukrainians will have less chances the next year to attack and to get Tokmak. And maybe the next year the Ukrainians will do the same. They will get the bottom of Robotina, and that's it. So obviously the next year the battle for Tokmak from the Ukrainian side will continue, but it doesn't mean that they're able to do anything or achieve anything. We have during the 2024-2023, the Ukrainians tried to develop their offensive operation also in Kamyansk. As a result of offensive, they captured Petikhatki. The Ukrainians returned control over Lapkova, but they were completely defeated in Zhiribyanki. The Russians repelled every single Ukrainian attack. Basically, the Russians destroyed completely 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. This brigade lost its combat capability, and as I understand, during the previous year, this brigade lost probably 3 or 4 times its combat capabilities. First time during the battle for Zhiribyanki, the Ukrainians had some plan to return control over Energodar and Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and later, if you remember, during October-November, the Russians using Tornado S missile system attacked 128th Brigade headquarters, and as a result of those strikes, the officers, the commanders of that brigade was destroyed a few times in this area. We have these geolocations, these icons. It was very powerful strikes with Iskander and with Tornado S systems. All these events took place on November of 2023. If you remember, this is the one of those strikes. Let's take a look at the game. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian positions, and as a result of a strike, that building was completely reduced to ruin. And it was not the only strike. This is the moment of a strike. Just a second. This is it. So few times this brigade was damaged by the Russians, few times in this area, and we know that scandal because some sources were saying that Ukrainians themselves provided this information to the Russians, where exactly this brigade were going to take to be located or something like this. So that was a very terrible situation. And now we are moving, and once again, all these updates is taking place from the 1st of November. Significant number of icons, significant number of events, and obviously the picture show us complete Russian superiority in different types of weapon, not just in let's say on situation on the ground, but also with missiles and the most important FABs. And now we are moving to Kherson direction. We will remember this area for many things. One of them, the first thing that comes to my mind is Kakhovka Dam. On the 6th of June, after the Ukrainians launched their greatest counter-offensive operation, and as soon as we start receiving significant video geolocated confirmations of destroyed Bradley, Strikers, Leopards, many types of Western weapon, something happened on Kakhovka Dam. This dam was destroyed, and this territory was flooded. And as a result of that, let's say, situation, that attack, that terract, the Russians were forced to step back from the edge positions from the islands, as well as the Ukrainians. But when the Wotsa left the territory, the Ukrainians was a little bit faster, and they managed to establish their footholds on the ex-Russian positions. The Ukrainians established their foothold in Dachi, ex-Russian territory in the south of Antonovka. The Ukrainians managed to establish control over the foothold to the south of Pridniprovska. As a result of some temporary operations, the Ukrainians managed to enter Kazachye Lageri, but then they were defeated and were forced to step back. And by the end of this year, the only thing Ukrainians managed to achieve is to create unstable foothold in Krynki. Some military experts are saying that the Russians are allowed the Ukrainians to keep this area because they can, let's say, control the Ukrainian population. They're attacking the Ukrainians with boats. The Ukrainians they attack the Ukrainians with Lancet. So the Ukrainians, to support this area, need to spend significant resources, material resources. They need to keep always artillery system on the combat line. They need to have air defense. They need to have boats. They need to send forces and everything. always every day the Russian attack these all these materials. And the most important, that exactly on Kherson direction the Russians start using FAB guided bombs. This is area of the most massive use of this type of weapon. The Russians start using not just FAB 500 but also FAB 1500, and as a result of the use of this type of weapon, the Russians managed to stabilize and to establish complete superiority in this area. The only thing that we should know that by the end of this year, according to some sources, the Ukrainians managed to shut down the Russians' planes with IRST system that recently was destroyed as well. But anyway, we see that this situation, Kherson, is under complete Russian control, no matter the losses and problems they faced during the year. When talking about the global scope, of course, the most important updates are coming not just from the situation on the ground. The Ukrainians during the year managed to damage the Crimean bridge once again. The Ukrainians managed to make a small movie on Crimea. They managed to land their infantry there, but later that crew was destroyed. The Russians completed the grain deal and established complete blockade over Odessa, and this year the Russians start bombing not just Odessa ports but the ports that located on Dunabi area. This year, for the first time since the creation of NATO organization, the Russian drones and Russian rockets start crossing the NATO border without any consequences for them. The Russian drones fell down on Romanian territory. According to some sources, the Russian missiles enter Poland territory. There was a case, if you remember, when Ukraine air defense system fell down on the territory of Poland and the Ukrainians blamed Russians, but it was fake. And when talking about the Ukrainians, this year finishes for them with a very terrible law of mobilization. The Ukrainians are planning to mobilize significant number of forces. We saw significant number of acts of democracy all over the entire Ukraine, where people are taken and just basically kidnapping. And obviously we understand that due to all these facts, the Ukrainians are planning to continue. Maybe the Russians would already started some negotiations, but the Ukrainians are not ready, or maybe the Western investors are not ready. The Ukrainians will receive help, will receive money, and obviously they will try to make another attempt to get Crimea and to get and establish control over Zaporozhye. To tell the truth, I'm not sure they're able to do this, but who knows. And that's it for 2023. Yes, that's it for 2023. Military Summaries channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, and Happy New Year, guys. Happy New Year.